Hey, here's a puzzle that's broken more deployments than I can count. Your model fits in VRAM comfortably. There's room to spare. You load it up, people start chatting, and memory keeps climbing. The weights haven't changed. Nothing about the model got bigger. But something inside the GPU is growing, token by token, and it's coming for your headroom. Short prompt? Fine. 10 people chatting? Fine. Then the conversations run long, one more request arrives, and CUDA out of memory. Same GPU. Same model. The weights are exactly the size they were 10 minutes ago. Something else ate the room, and it wasn't the thing you sized for. Put the two extremes side by side. One request, 2,000 tokens, about 1/10 of a gigabyte of extra memory. 32 requests at 32,000 tokens each, 60 gigabytes. The weights block is pixel for pixel identical in both. Nothing about the model changed, only what you asked it to do. That growing block has a name. The KV cache. It's memory the model sets aside to remember every earlier token in a conversation, so it never has to work them out twice. It grows one token at a time, and it's the entire subject of this video. So why does it need to exist at all? Start with how generation works. The model never writes a full answer in one shot. It predicts one token, sticks it on the end, then predicts again using the now longer sequence. The cat sat becomes the cat sat on, becomes the cat sat on the. Same loop, over and over, for every token in the reply. And each time around that loop, the new token has to look backward. To decide what comes next, it checks the tokens that came before it. That lookup is attention. Which means every earlier token has to still be reachable, and attention needs 3 specific things from each one of them. Query, key, value. One line each. The query is what the current token is looking for. The key is what an earlier token has to offer. And the value is what that earlier token contributes, once it gets picked. The new token's query gets compared against every earlier key, and the better the match, the more that value shapes what comes out. So the comparison runs across the whole history. Every earlier key gets a compatibility score against the current query. High score, that token's value gets more influence. Low score, it barely registers. Sum it all up, weighted, and that feeds the prediction. Now, here's the part that matters for memory. Here's the asymmetry that makes a cache necessary. A token's key and value freeze the moment that token exists. Token 500's key is identical when you're all the way out at token 50,000, and every later token still checks it. The query, though? Used once, while that token was being generated. Nothing ever asks what token 500 was looking for. Keys stay. Queries die. You could recompute those keys and values from scratch every single time. But think about what that costs. The conversation only ever gets longer, so you'd redo the exact same work, over and over, forever. It's pure waste. So the model doesn't. Compute once, store it, and every later token reads what's already sitting there. That stored history is the KV cache. It falls straight out of 2 facts, attention needs the whole past, and text comes out one token at a time. Put those together and a cache isn't a design choice, it's unavoidable. Which raises the obvious question. How big does the thing get? Here's the sizing equation, term by term. Batch size, how many requests at once? Sequence length, how many tokens? Number of layers, because every layer keeps its own copy. Times 2, 4 keys and values. Then number of KV heads, head dimension, and bytes per element for your precision. Multiply all of that out, and that's your cache. Let's plug in real numbers. Qwen 2.57b, 28 layers. 4 KV heads. Head dimension of 128, that's a hidden size of 3584 divided across 28 attention heads. And 2 bytes per element, since we're in BF16. These aren't rounded off guesses. They come straight out of the model's config. Chain it together. 28 times 2 is 56. Times 4 KV heads, 224. Times a head dimension of 128, 28,672. Times 2 bytes, 57,344 bytes. Which is 56 kilobytes. Per token, per concurrent request. That's your unit cost, locked in. 56 kilobytes. Next to a 15.2 gigabyte model, that's a rounding error.
And that's exactly why it's dangerous. The cost of one token was never the problem.
The problem is everything you multiply it by. Multiplier 1, how long the conversation runs. Every token that's ever appeared keeps its key and value parked in the cache.
Nothing gets thrown away while the session stays open, because any later token might still want to look back at it.
Token 1 contributes an entry.
Token 32,000 is just the 32,000th, sitting alongside every single one before it. So double the tokens, and the list holding those pairs is twice as long. Plot it, and you get a straight line, no curve, no surprise. At 2,048 tokens, 0.12 gigabytes. At 32,768, 1.88. 16 times longer, 16 times bigger.
Exactly linear. Multiplier 2, how many conversations at once? Each concurrent request, a separate person, a separate session, carries its own independent history.
Its own keys and values for all of its tokens, shared with nobody. Serving engines call a group of these a batch, but the name oversells it. A batch is nothing more than the requests running right now, each one hauling its own private past. So 32 people talking to the model at the same moment means 32 complete, separate copies of that cache, sitting side by side in VRAM.
At 32K context, that's 32 times 1.88 gigabytes. 60.1 gigabytes of cache alone. Here's the whole grid. 512 tokens is trivial, hundredths of a gigabyte. 2048, still comfortable. 8000 at batch 32 and you're at 15 gigabytes. 32K at batch 32, 60.13. And 131,000 tokens, which needs yarn scaling turned on, reaches 240 gigabytes. Read it in two directions. Go down a column and longer conversations multiply the number. Go across a row and more concurrent requests multiply it again.
Both axes climb, and they climb on top of each other, which is how you end up in that bottom right corner at 240 gigabytes, firmly in multi-GPU territory.
And this is where intuition breaks.
Batch 8 at 8,000 tokens is 3.76 gigabytes, nowhere near a crash. Grow both by 4, 32 requests, 32,000 tokens.
4 times 4 is 16. 60.13 gigabytes. Two climbing things multiplied, not added. Stack that on an 80 gigabyte GPU.
15.2 for weights, 60.13 for cache, plus runtime overhead, and you've cracked straight through the ceiling. But notice, the cache never jumped.
It grew smoothly the whole way. The only abrupt thing here is crossing the line.
Same shape of crash the previous video opened on.
Now, if you know anything about transformers, something in there fell off. Attention has a famous quadratic reputation, order sequence length squared. And everything I showed you was dead linear. So which is it?
Both. They're describing two different moments in generation, and mixing them up is where people get burned.
So where does that famous quadratic reputation come from? Prefill. The model reads all n-prompt tokens at once.
It's causal. Token 1 looks at one position, token n looks at n, but sum that up and the work still scales as n squared.
And a naive implementation builds a full sequence-by-sequence score matrix. Quadratic in memory too. Second moment, decode. Once the prompt's been processed, generation goes one token at a time. Each new token is a single query attending over the n keys already sitting in the cache. 1 by n, not n by n. That step is linear.
Same shape as the cache itself, which is no coincidence, because it's reading exactly that cache.
So both claims are correct, about different things.
What's stored grows linearly, one more entry per generated token, steadily, for the life of the conversation. What's computed spikes quadratically, once, at the very start of each request.
Storage is the long tail. Prefill is the spike. And that quadratic score matrix? Fused kernels like flash attention never build the whole thing in GPU memory.
They tile it, process block by block, and discard what they don't need along the way.
The underlying math stays quadratic, the memory it costs you drops dramatically. Confusing those two is the trap. So how do you pull that number down? Two levers.
One's already pulled for you: Quen's grouped query attention, sharing keys and values across heads. The other, cache quantization, sits untouched until you reach over and ask for it.
Qwen 2.57b has 28 query heads. but only 4 kV heads.
So groups of 7 queries share one stored key and value pair and architecture choice called grouped query attention. You still get all 28 queries doing their thing at attention time.
You store 7 times less to feed them.
That's a 7 times reduction, and it happened before any number I've shown you even applied. Without it, that 32K cache at batch 1 would be 13 GB instead of 1.88.
So those numbers already looked rough with the good architecture in place. Okay, so you're staring at 60 GB.
The obvious move is quantization, store each number in fewer bits, for instead of 16.
Every engineer reaches for that lever first.
And for this particular problem, it's the wrong one to grab, for a reason that catches almost everybody.
Here's why. Quantizing weights and quantizing the cache are two completely separate decisions.
Shrinking weights from BF16 down to NF4 takes 15.2 GB to around 5, a real win, worth doing. But it does nothing to the cache. The cache is sized by context length and concurrency, not by how your weights happen to be stored.
So by default, a 4-bit model still keeps a full BF16 kV cache. Serving stacks can quantize the cache too, but only if you explicitly ask them to.
Leave the toggle where it ships, run a long context, multi-user job, and you can still fail on the cache alone with a tiny little model loaded.
And one last wrinkle, because CUDA does you no favors here. Out of memory is the same message no matter what blew up.
It's not the KV cache's fault by default, for other things can spike just as suddenly, and the error gives you nothing to tell them apart.
Let's meet the tenants.
Tenant 1, Training Activations. Every sample keeps its own saved activations for backpropagation, and that scales roughly linearly with batch size. Under the series activation model, about 16.4 GB at batch 4 becomes 32.9 at batch 8.
Double the batch, double the bill.
The fix is gradient accumulation, same effective batch size, far less memory per microbatch.
Tenant 2, Attention Workspace. Remember that full sequence attention matrix from Prefill? It's back, same structure, this time during training, quadratic in memory if you build it naively.
And the fix is the same as before, flash attention, tiled, never materialized in full.
Tenant 3, the logit spike.
Cross-entropy loss needs a tensor-shaped batch by sequence by vocabulary size, 1.25 GB in BF16 at batch 2, sequence 2048. But current Hugging Face loss code upcasts to FP32 first, so in practice you're closer to 2.49. The fix is chunked or cut cross-entropy, which never builds the full tensor.
Tenant 4, Fragmentation. PyTorch's allocator can leave your free memory scattered into pieces that are individually too small for one big request even while the headline free total looks perfectly healthy.
Expandable segments mitigate some patterns.
Not all.
And it can't help you when the request exceeds what's free to begin with.
4 tenants. 1 error message, and it fits equally well over any of them. Knowing the formula is one skill. Knowing which tenant to blame on a specific crash is a different one, and it's the one this video hasn't given you yet.
Worth adding, the numbers for any of these swing wildly depending on precision and head counts.
So always state your assumptions. Step back for a second.
The important number was never 7 billion parameters. For inference, the bill depends on how much history you keep and how many conversations you keep alive at once.
Parameter count tells you the floor. The workload tells you what you'll actually pay.
Same model badge on both cards. Qwen 2.57b costs about 56 kilobytes of BF16 kV cache per token, per active request. 1 short conversation, almost nothing. 32 conversations at 32,000 tokens each, about 60 gigabytes. Nothing about the model changed between those two numbers.
Only the workload did. The next video puts all of this to work.
Same 7.61 billion parameter model, 5 workloads computed from these exact formulas, 3 GPUs, AT4, NA140, NA180.
You'll watch each one cross from fits to out of memory, including 2 configurations that throw the identical error message for completely opposite reasons.
So, the KV cache grows linearly with tokens and with requests, and it's the thing quietly eating your headroom. Prefill attention is quadratic, but once, at the start.
2 moments, 2 different shapes.
If this is the kind of thing you like chewing on, stick with the series. The next video is where we make all of it predict real crashes.